Hi, Ed here from Crystal Clear Aquatics, and I'm working on my next assignment, which is cleaning out this wonderful pond behind me. I really enjoy doing a nice pond clean. I mean, who doesn't like pond dipping? It's always quite exciting. You don't know what you're going to find when you drain a pond. I know in this particular one it's teeming with rudd. We're expecting hundreds and hundreds of rudd, which at the moment you wouldn't really expect to see any livestock. There's no movement on the surface. You can't see any signs of fish, but I've witnessed firsthand when you put a bit of food in the pond, the feeding frenzy, so there are a lot of fish in here. This is a beautifully designed pond. Lovely natural stonework, really established with all these little microferns and mosses growing in amongst it. But the initial issue with this pond was that it was green, it wasn't clearing. There's some very good filtration, a couple of good Awasa filters on this unit, but unfortunately there wasn't enough power sockets to be able to utilise the UVCs on the filters, and as a result, of course, the pond was going green. But the UVs have been switched on now, and the green hue has gone, but instead it's been left with this brown murky condition, and this is classic signs of suspended sediment, usually as a result of quite a large accumulation of sediment and muck which is collected at the bottom of the pond. And filtration really is designed to maintain a clear pond in an already clean environment. It's not so good at actually getting rid of already heavy soiled, dirty water. So now the system is up and running properly, we need to get the pond cleaned out, physically get rid of the bulk of the sediment and the muck to allow the filters to have a chance to then maintain a clean and clear pond. And we'll document draining this pond. As part of the clean, the pond is fully drained, holding tank set up so that we can establish a sort of a safe environment for the fish to go into and any other livestock we encounter whilst we're doing this. A large proportion of this water wants to be maintained and kept because there's an awful lot of goodness, you know, biologically. It's established, it's teeming with essential nitrifying bacteria. So we'll want to be, you know, holding on to a good sort of 70 or 80% of this water with some very large holding tanks I'll set up, and this will be returned back into the pond once it's cleaned. There's a lot of planting that needs to be done. You see at the back of the pond here we've got lots of irises, a couple of big islands of water lily here which I'm sure will need to be split and potted on. Some lovely large Thalias in the centre of the pond there again, which may well need some attention. But it's a fun project to work on, and I'm sure a very messy one as well. Pond's emptying nicely. There's a lot of water in here and a lot of sediment, and you can see the pond has been built up with a shallow shelf running around the majority of the side here, and this has been covered then in stones and shingle. Aesthetically that's lovely, especially when the pond is clear, but of course what tends to happen is that the stones and the cobbles, etc., really are just a trap for sediment and particles. So from a practical point of view, it's never ideal having gravel or shingle in a pond, but looked after, annual maintenance 2 or 3 times a year with a vacuum, we'll be able to keep the bulk of the sediment off of this and keep it looking nice and clean. So from a feature point of view, it would be nice to keep this. The planting is in good shape. Most of the marginals here are nicely anchored. In fact, they've been using some of the shingle and the stones here to help anchor themselves in. So a lot of this can remain in situ and we can work around this. The water lilies certainly need to be potted on, and there's a couple of these big Thalias here, or Thalias, that have become quite buoyant, and they're going to need to be split and potted on as well. The lizard's tail, this Sorid cernus at the back here, has really taken off. It's not often I see that one in a pond, and it's doing very nicely. Likewise the pickerel, the ponded terrier over here in the corner, and another nice clump over here. That's, as I always say, one of my favourite plants, and that's looking very nice. Still very little signs of the fish in the pond. A few little jumps, but again they're remaining very well hidden, and there are tons and tons of fish in here. So at this stage of the job it tends to be quite a sort of a slow waiting game of just waiting for the pond to drain, and then suddenly all at once it becomes a mad panic as we try to hook out the fish and get the livestock out. We've got a holding tank here set up for the fish, so we've got 1800 gallons of reserve water in here with an air pump just to keep it aerated. another 3,000 gallons of the pond held in this tank here, and another 1,000 gallons held in these two bowsers over here, and then the remainder of the water, which is going to be quite mucky, we are now discharging to waste and just flushing off into the garden. As long as we can retain 50% or so of the original pond water, it's safe to top up then with tap water and to condition and dechlorinate. Got a couple of filtration systems here that we're going to be servicing as well. We've got here an Awaza Screenmatic. It's not looking in bad shape actually, it's quite nice and clean, but the foams will get taken out and manually cleaned. And then over here we've got another filtration system, an Awaza Filter Clear. This is a 30,000, so another filter to service. It's a beautiful day. I haven't done a pond clean for a little while, so it's going to be quite nice to get hands on, get a bit mucky and see what we find. This lovely lizard's tail here has created a fantastic natural kind of habitat, cover, shade for the fish, but it's under here where a lot of them are lurking. So we're going to get this cut back. You've got to be very careful when you're cutting away plants like this, because it's very easy to inadvertently snip a cable from a pump or a light. I think I'm aware of all the electrical appliances, but it may well be that there's a third pump I'm not aware of routing this way, so I need to be careful. A black cable covered in silt and slime can look just like the stem of a plant. Interestingly, Saurus cernus means nodding lizard. I just looked that up actually on Google. The more water we're taking out, the more evident it is that there's an awful lot of muck and silt and leaf debris in here. Now, a pond clean isn't something that wants to be done on a pond too frequently. It's quite invasive. It takes a long time for a pond to recover. So that's why it's very important that, one, I want to make sure that we keep as much of the original pond water as possible. On average, about every 5 to 8 years, it's worth draining a pond down fully and giving it a clean like this. But once it's clean, as long as we then do regular maintenance, 2 or 3 times a year, a pond vac to reduce accumulated sediment, making sure we keep on top of the filtration and replacing consumables like foams and UV tubes to the schedule, the pond shouldn't ever build up with as much muck as it has done. Right, there's a lot of fish that are getting caught up in here now, so I need to hurry up. This is a classic example of a water lily which has become very overgrown. Once upon a time this was in a basket, or possibly 2. And over the years the rhizomes have crept over the sides of the basket, and because there's so much sediment and muck in the pond, it's allowed it to root freely and start to take a hold. When you're dealing with plants like this, it can become very, very heavy and unmanageable. And the best thing to do is very carefully with a little saw is to just chop it up into manageable sections that can then be dealt with. Each one of these is going to produce, you know, a perfectly viable plant. You can end up with masses of additional lilies here if you wanted. Eventually, water lilies particularly become really buoyant as their thick rhizomes and the abundance of lily pads start to lift the plant and to make it float. A real telltale sign that lilies need to be repotted is when the leaves start to grow proud of the surface, and that's either a sign that the plant itself is in too shallow a water, or it's too big a variety for that depth of water, or more likely that it's started to lift and get to the surface, and a sign to be repotted. So obviously when you're working in a pond like this with tools and saws, you've got to be so careful not to damage a liner, pipework or cables. So I always like to get my leg underneath the rhizome where I'm cutting, and then if I go too far, it's my leg I cut and not the pond. That's dedication for you. So far, there's no signs of any basket. It's just root. I mean, sometimes you'll see people just weighing down lilies underneath a couple of bricks in a pond. And of course it takes a hole and it becomes like this. If only you could smell this. This is the build-up of... Oh, crumbs, there's a deep hole there. This is a build-up of sediment and muck that accumulates in the pond over the years. So a lot of this is decaying single-celled algae which forms green water, and as it dies it becomes this sediment and detritus. A lot of it is just organic matter that decomposes in the pond, leaves and decaying plants and that kind of thing. But you can see it's a pretty yucky substance. A bit too thick really for the pond vac, so it's scoops and bales. So with the use of our trusty Awaza Pondovac 5, we've been able to remove the last of the water, leaving behind this deeper section, which is now teeming with fish. Mostly rudd, lots and lots and lots of rudd. There's one nice shabunk in there, and there appears to be a couple of tench. Here we go. Lovely, lovely fish. Look at that gorgeous fish. I love tench. So we'll hook these out now, get them out in the holding tank, and then we can resume the muck removal. Some people would pay good money to have this in their garden, I'm sure, or on their skin. So this is the bulk of the muck taken out of the pond now, and most of the plant life and foliage cut back, and this will allow us now to start rinsing through a lot of the shingle and the stones which are covered in all the muck. It's quite a big mess to deal with now. I just wanted to show you these. This is a wonderful semi-tropical plant called Thalia. It's hardy in the UK, frost hardy down to about -15. It would be classed as a deep water marginal. It will grow in kind of 18 inches, even up to 2 feet of water when it's established like this. And it's got this lovely, lovely tropical foliage. I mean, it's reminiscent of a banana almost. It's a fantastic plant with these enormous flower spikes which are purple when they're out in bloom. A lovely, lovely plant, and this is about the tallest I've seen Thalia grow over in the UK here. But as the majority of pond plants, these get cut back in autumn. It's a little bit early. I wouldn't normally cut back plants to this extent until sort of, the end of October, November onwards, once we had a frost or two. But for the sake of the pond clean, to be able to get all of that muck out from amongst the plants, it makes it easier if they're trimmed back. And although there might be a little bit of regrowth if it's mild, there shouldn't be any issues, and it means that next season the growth that comes through will be unhindered and will be nice and green. It's starting to get quite mucky. So I think originally the idea was that these margins on the shelf was covered in the shingle, and it appears that lots and lots of marginal plants have been sort of scattered around and piled up with cobbles and things just to keep them in place, and then over the years the plants have kind of broken through their baskets and actually created these quite nice natural looking clumps of foliage. Unfortunately there hasn't been any sort of retainer put in to hold this gravel or sort of bank of cobbles back, so a lot of it has slipped in the pond over time, which makes cleaning that much harder. We'll pick up a lot of this and get that back in the shallows and pile it up around the plants. but making good progress today. It's day 2 on this pond clean, and the weather is pretty horrific this morning. My mantra, you get wet doing this, whatever the weather. So yeah, as long as you've got the right clothing, it's okay. So as part of the clean, some of the water lilies and plants have needed to be split and potted on. So I'm just doing the water lilies at the moment. Now I'm not using aquatic soil, I'm just using a fine 10mm shingle or a grit in which to root and sort of pot on these water lilies. So I've broken up bits of the rhizome, so we've got a decent eye of new growth and a section of rhizome and some of the white root. And I'm just going to position that in the basket and surround that with gravel, making sure that the eye, the tip of new growth, is raised just proud of the surface of the gravel, so it's not covered. I'll be able to squeeze 4 or 5 of these sections of root in here. It's helpful actually if you leave a reasonably long stem on here if the basket size permits, because it's much easier to get this anchored down when you've got a longer section of root. The rootstock itself, the rhizome, is quite buoyant, and if it's not well anchored, as soon as you put this in the pond, that sudden rush of water, a lot of the gravel will start to displace and move, so you have to place it in very carefully. But if you're not careful, a lot of this root will then immediately start to float, and it will need to be potted back on again, and it's not quite so easy to do when it's underwater. So I've got 2 or 3 of these to do. We can do a final rinse of the pond. There's still a bit of muck that Dave is hooking out. Lovely stuff. And then the gravel can have another rinse. And then that's the pond essentially done. We can then move on to the filtration system, get that stripped apart and cleaned, and start to think about reassembling the pond. So there we go. The pond is clean and the sun's come out. I mean, there's still a bit of debris and muck caught up within the gravel, but unless we take all of that out and wash it bit by bit in buckets, it's not going to come completely clean. And seeing as we are returning the reserved water, which is already a little bit mucky, I'm not too concerned about a small amount of muck within the gravel. The most important thing, and the main reason for doing this clean in the first place, was to get rid of the huge amount of slurry and sediment that had collected over the years at the base of the pond. There was no way that the filtration was going to be able to cope and clear the pond with the quantity of fish, particularly those 2 tench, stirring up the sediment, getting it in suspension and clouding the water up. So now we've got rid of that, the filtration has a fighting chance to be able to clarify and keep the pond clear. And whilst we're on the subject of filtration, a couple of my pet hates. One of them is why oh why when people build ponds can't they put a conduit in so you can feed cables through. This is the pump cable cemented into the stonework. Now at some point it's either had to be replaced, hence the join here, or it's possible the join was put in there so if you do replace one in the future you can do so, but that was an expensive way of doing so. But when you're talking about pumps like this, Aquamax Eco Premium 20,000, you know, it's £500 or £600 worth of pump. Should a failure occur, you want to be able to replace it and feed a cable through without cutting the cable and joining onto it, or I suppose routing a new cable over the top. And one other issue. So this is the Awaza Filter Clear 30,000. This is okay. The foams were pretty mucky. There was a lot of tension on the electrical cable and there's almost not enough flex loose flex to be able to remove the quartz sleeve and the ballast for UV tube replacement. It's right on the limit, so whenever you install these, make sure you've got, you know, a couple of feet of slack cable to allow you to pull out that ballast for bulb replacement every year. And again, on here we've got the Awaza Screenmatic 2, fantastic filtration system. I'm just in the process of vacuuming it out. There's a lot of accumulated slurry and muck that's built up over there. The foams aren't in too bad a shape, they'll get it clean and get put back, but there was a lot of settled muck in the bottom. But there's a Bitron UVC bolted onto the side of here, and for future bulb replacement, the ballast on the side of the Bitron will twist and release and pull out this way. And of course there's no room to do so because there's a lot of heavy growth of plants over the years that are built up. So next spring, when we come to bulb replacement, a lot of this is going to have to get cut back to allow access. Something to think about when you do installations of filters. Pond's filling up nicely. We've been able to retain more than 50% of the original water, which is being pumped back in. So the livestock will be able to go back into a nice stable environment. It's not going to be too different for them. The water chemistry will be much the same. And we're almost at the time of netting the fish out. These are fantastic tanks for the use of the livestock holding, these Intex kiddies pools. This is actually my my children's paddling pool. They don't know I've pinched it. Sorry kids. And believe it or not, there are hundreds and hundreds of fish lurking at the bottom. So we're almost at fish collection time. We're draining the holding tank right down to just a couple of inches of water. It might seem a little bit distressing or cruel for the fish, but it's much easier to catch the fish when there's little water like this. The speed here is key, so the quicker we can get them out and back into the pond, the happier they will be. But just to show you briefly what we're dealing with, we've got a couple of lovely green tench. He's a lovely chap, one of my favourite fish, Tinker. Lovely scales on the side. Also nicknamed the doctor fish or the medicine fish. I don't think there's any truth behind it, but supposedly they've got a very thick slime coat which has antibacterial properties, and it helps to prevent disease in other pond fish. A nice bottom feeder and a nice fish to have. If I can grab one. The dominant species in the pond, whoa, a golden rudd. There we go. This is a nice adult rudd. Lovely fish. Quite prolific. They'll breed quite happily in a pond. But they don't get too large. They're not messy. And if you want to have a pond as heron proof as possible and don't want to net it, then golden rudd are a lovely fish to have in a pond, because they'll breed quickly. You go in the depths. They're not very colourful, so they're more heron resistant. But I think we'll get these fish out pretty quick now. Paddling pool was a lovely place to be this summer. Now look at the state of it. So if you want a nice shoaling fish in your pond, which is pretty heron proof, I think the humble golden rudd is a lovely addition. Shoaling fish, pretty undemanding, can be left alone to their own devices, no food required if you don't want to, and it's lovely to see a school of these, you know, smaller fish cruising around in your pond. Kids will never know. So we've got a bit of topping up to do. I'm just going to add some treatments to the pond, some water conditioner to treat the new tap water that's going in. Got some anti-blanket retreatment to go in. Cloverleaf blanket answer is my treatment of choice. and that's because there's a lot of nutrients that are going into the pond from the tap water. That's going to encourage algae to grow, so the blanket answer is going to help prevent that. And lastly, an Evolution Aqua Pond Bomb, which is a sort of a gel encapsulated ball full of nitrifying bacteria which will help to get the pond established, and I'll put that in the filter. A lot of leaves and bits and pieces I just want to skim off, but otherwise that is the job done. So I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics. Thank you for watching. See you in the next pond. Right, so it's been a couple of weeks since the pond clean, and we're just going to come and have a look at the pond, see how it's doing. Hopefully it'll be clear by now. Yes, much better. Not crystal clear, but much better. So there's definitely no sign of green. Very little brown sediment. You can actually see the bottom of the pond. I can see the baskets and the water lilies over there, but there is still a way to go for clarity. The water now needs to polish, and that will happen over the next few weeks or so with the filtration running. Much better though. Now it's really important to note that the pond hasn't cleared because of the pond clean. The pond clean has allowed the filtration to do its job. The important thing was to get rid of that silt and sediment from the base of the pond so that the filters could cope then with the reduction of sediment. So if you haven't got a decent filtration setup, a pond clean on its own isn't going to keep a pond clear, certainly not long term. Well, I'm pleased to see the pond filled up and the fruits of our labour have worked, which is always good. So it'll be interesting to come back at a later date, early next year when the plants are coming through, and see the pond looking at its best. And at that stage the filtration systems will have UV tubes replaced and another service. Good. Well, this really is the end of the video now. Thank you for watching. I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics, and I'll see you on the next pond. Thank you for watching.